Okay, so Jesus is dead, tomb is empty. How do you know he actually appeared to people? Because now is when it tends to get more supernatural.
We're either in for a lesson about the resurrection, or we're watching the worst Dockers commercial ever. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you're new to the channel, take a second to tap on the subscribe button so you'll be notified when new science, theology, and news videos come out. I recently came across an odd video clip where it appears J. Warner Wallace invited Sean McDowell over to see his new trophy room and then trapped him there in an awkward conversation, which we join partway through.
Yeah, so we have our claims that are written very early.
There is considerable debate over when the Gospels were written. That Mark was written first is accepted by nearly all scholars. Most estimate it was written after 70 CE, though some more conservative camps want to push it back to 60 CE or so. The others were written later, with John probably 40 years later. Any way you slice it, these Gospels were written 30 to 70 years after the events they purport to describe. Is that early? I'm sure you've experienced stories that grow in just days and weeks. How much could a story change and grow in decades?
One of the things we look at as detectives are four things related to eyewitnesses. Were they written early? Were they really there to see what it is they said they saw?
None of the Gospel writers claim to have been there personally. This is a later idea imposed on the text. We don't know who wrote them. They are all anonymous. Centuries later, the church fathers decided to attach names to them to lend credibility. Whoever wrote Luke admits he compiled his accounts from other people. And whoever wrote Matthew copied most of Mark word for word, which is a strange thing to do if you're trying to write your own eyewitness account.
Yeah. Two, can they be corroborated in some way?
Can the resurrection accounts be corroborated in some way? I would love to see that. As far as I know, there are no such accounts outside the Bible.
Three, have they changed their story over time?
We know that copying errors and even blatant late insertions happen to the text, but that's not telling us if the writers changed their story. Difficult to know since they didn't write a second time to give us something to compare to. Certainly scholars for centuries have noticed that the supernatural and divine story elements grow and grow over time from Mark, then to Matthew, Luke, and John, and continuing on to all the Gospels that were written after, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Peter, the Infancy Gospel, and so on and so on. The stories get more and more exaggerated over time. There's even a scholarly phrase for this: high Christology.
Because the Jesus of Nazareth, he would say, was very simple, and then over time he got distorted. They added the miracle accounts, they added the resurrection, they added the high Christology of Jesus, until finally you have the divine Christ of Christianity.
And if the story was growing during the years it was being recorded, why would we think it was staying static in the decades before, where it was basically uncontrolled gossip?
Or do they have a bias?
The Gospel writers clearly have a bias. These are primarily theological texts, advocating heavily for the Messiah status of Jesus.
So the question with the accounts related to the resurrection is, how early are these accounts? Because you can lie about somebody if everyone who knew the truth is already dead, okay? So if they're written at the time when people would know if they're lying.
Is there anyone who hasn't been victim to a false story spreading about them and being accepted as truth by at least some people, even though we're alive to ask if the story is true? And that's today, with social media and Google. How do we know that the people featured in the Gospels weren't running around, objecting to their depiction? They may well have been. And these are books written in scholarly Greek, where the characters are uneducated people who spoke Aramaic. How were they even supposed to know what was being said about them? I don't understand how Wallace's idea of first century fact-checking was supposed to work.
And if you look at, for example, the claims in 1 Corinthians, where Paul boldly says, at a period of time between 53 and 57 AD, very early in history.
That's at least 20 years after the time of Jesus' crucifixion, an event Paul didn't witness as far as we know. But let me help the good detective here. Christian scholars contend that in the 1 Corinthians passage in question, Paul is reciting a creed that became common in the early church in the first decade after Jesus' death. If that hypothesis is accepted, this quote is even earlier. But conceding this also concedes that Paul cannot personally attest to what he's regurgitating, any more than your strange aunt can personally attest to the content of the meme she posted to Facebook last week.
He boldly says that, hey, if you don't believe me, there are 500 people who are still here who saw Jesus on the same day. Now, either that's an incredibly gutsy lie that he's hoping nobody will check, or he's just telling the truth.
Or he's simply repeating something he has reason to accept, but did not personally witness. He could be mistaken or misled. Purely for the sake of argument, let's say this 500 viewer thing is all made up, and that someone wanted to check on this claim. How would you do it? Let's assume this happened in or near Jerusalem, a city of about 40,000 people at the time, swelling to 250,000 during festivals. You arrive into town, and then what? You start asking random people if they were part of the group. Excuse me, sir, did you see resurrected Jesus? No? And you, ma'am, did you see resurrected Jesus? No? How many no's would it take to disprove the claim? Even 40,000 no's wouldn't disprove it. And suppose a handful of people said, yeah, I was there. How would one know if that person was actually there, or might merely be playing along that they were so that they could feel important and included, or that the person had actually come to believe they were part of something when really they had not? If anecdotes were to be counted, millions of people would have attended Woodstock rather than the few 100,000 who actually did.
And there are still 500 people, most of whom are still alive. You could ask, and they all saw Jesus rise from the dead on the same day. That's a very early, bold claim.
Again, I don't see how someone was supposed to go ask 500 unnamed people in a different town about a thing that happened at least 20 years ago. I remember back in 1999, a whole bunch of us saw a cow do an Olympic caliber gymnastics routine, complete with an amazing backflip, and she stuck the landing. There had to have been several hundred people there. If you don't believe me, just go ask them.
The fact that they claim to see Jesus alive does not mean he really rose from the dead yet.
I hate to keep returning to this, but who exactly is claiming to have seen Jesus alive? We have claims that there are claims. Well, claims of claims that there are claims. What we don't have is anyone saying, I personally saw a resurrected Jesus. Well, we have one of those. I'm sure we'll get to that.
But now you've got to account for the empty tomb.
You don't. The empty tomb is a detail found only in the gospel stories. It is not attested to in any extra-biblical source, nor, frankly, even anywhere else in the Bible. The world's leading resurrection scholar and minimal facts proponent Gary Habermas excludes the empty tomb from his list of facts for good reason. Scholars don't back it up as historical fact. It's merely a detail in the story we're investigating. It's like saying, if Hansel and Gretel didn't happen, you have to account for the gingerbread house. What gingerbread house?
How are you going to explain the claim? How is it we can explain that they at least said they saw Jesus alive?
Why do we have to account for claims? A claim isn't evidence. A claim is the thing that needs evidence.
So what the common objection I hear and often have to respond to is, well, they just saw hallucinations.
Right, and so I think that's, and I think in some sense early on I might have agreed with that. Here's why I say that. If you really desperately did not want to see Jesus die to begin with, like you loved him so much, you can't believe he was taken from us, I could see you wanting him back so much that in a one-on-one, you might hallucinate something. So maybe Mary, for example, there's one description of Mary alone, and she sees what she thinks is Jesus. This is, so it's the gardener. No, it is Jesus. Well, maybe it is the gardener. You just imagine it was Jesus because you wanted it so badly.
Or, since this gardener story is in John's Gospel only, written a good 30 years after Mark, maybe it didn't really happen and was merely part of a growing legend.
There's also a single description of Peter seeing Jesus.
Here's the passage from Luke 24:34.
The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon.
No other details are given. This is not a first-hand account. At best, the author heard from some woman about what the disciples say about what Peter says he saw. By my count, that's fourth-hand information, best case scenario. For the sake of this discussion, let's grant that Peter wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. Scholars don't think that he did, but let's grant it for the sake of discussion. Even those letters say nothing about Peter having seen a resurrected Jesus. Again, the best explanation is that this didn't happen at all, but is just hearsay and growing legend. That said, Peter having a one-on-one hallucination of Jesus of some kind has some potential explanatory power for some early church traditions, as well as hints to post-bereavement hallucination experience is a common and studied phenomenon among the fatigued and grieving. We can't rule it out.
There's a single description of James seeing Jesus. I can see maybe James wants to see Jesus alive.
I trust you'll forgive me for the time intrusion, but I think it's important that we hear this entire story with every word of detail that the Bible has to offer on the appearance to James.
Then he appeared to James.
Oh, that's it. That's part of the 1 Corinthians 15 list. So it's Paul, quoting a creed meme, that arose from the stories told by early believers who may or may not have even met James. At most generous, this is third hand. But it's difficult to see the oral tradition from which this arose as anything but legendary development. And again, let's grant momentarily that the brother of Jesus was actually the author of the book of James. That book is entirely silent on seeing a resurrected Jesus. I'm not seeing an account here that needs explaining.
What do you do with Paul? Paul sees him on the road to Damascus, and I don't think Paul wants Jesus to be alive. I think Paul really has a reason to reject Jesus being alive.
Saul of Tarsus, who later took the name Paul, was, by his own account, going around persecuting and possibly murdering fellow Jews who called themselves Christians. That horror, guilt, and regret over these actions might trigger some kind of traumatic psychological break on an introspective journey is extremely easy to anticipate and explain. It is common for people who are zealous to do 180-degree flips and become equally zealous in the exact opposite direction. According to some, I might be an example of this. Add to this the fact that Paul himself never describes his interaction with Jesus as physical, using only the vocabulary of internal vision. The 3 different versions in Acts indicate light and words that only Paul experiences. In fact, in 2 Corinthians, Paul admits to his uncertainty about the nature of his interaction with Jesus.
Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows.
Even if you accept that Paul spoke with actual Jesus, the accounts are far better explained with an internal vision than with Jesus' physical earth body returning to earth years after it is said to have left into heaven. Hallucination or divine, this interaction was in Paul's head.
Then you have something even more difficult. You have repeated, persistent accounts of more than one person seeing Jesus at the same time.
Repeated accounts? Of all the post-resurrection appearance stories, only one can be found in 2 sources. The rest are one-shots, no corroboration even in the Bible. By repeated, do you mean that there were lots of different stories? If stories of Jesus were circulating, wouldn't it make sense that new stories might crop up? Like members of churches where there is speaking of tongues pretend to also speak in tongues, even though they're just playing along, so that they can fit in or get positive affirmation? Or what about the persistent repetition of thousands of alien abduction stories? The detective is entirely ignoring the fact that none of these group experience accounts are first-hand. They are best explained as story elements. And a story with multiple characters isn't somehow more reliable than a story with one character.
So on the road to Emmaus, I think there's 2 or 3.
It's 2, as told in Luke 24. Fun fact, that's one of the appearances of Jesus where the man didn't look like Jesus.
Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him.
If any conversation with a man that doesn't look like Jesus can be later attributed to be Jesus, that's a pretty low bar.
On the lake, there's 7.
Again, an unconfirmed story element found only in the last written gospel. That the story has 7 characters is no more or less convincing than 2 characters, or 20.
There's at the room, the empty room where Thomas is not there yet. There's 10. It's the 12 minus Judas minus Thomas. There's 10.
Again, that 10 were there is a mere numerical detail of a non-corroborated story where it is alleged that resurrected Jesus had people touch his wounds. If Wallace knows I'm going to be skeptical of the supernatural part of the story, I'm not sure why he thinks I'm just going to go along with the number of attendees as grounded in fact.
So the variety and the kinds,
Too
the
many.
places and the times.
How many is too many? What is the standard for too many? Again, I could point to alien abduction stories where there are hundreds on records with real names of living people attached to them. How many alien abduction stories is too many to continue doubting that any of them happened?
Just
Well, look,
in
if I told you
circumstances.
last night I dreamt I was in a red Tesla on Mulholland Drive driving around the corner, and you said, yeah.
Borrowed my Tesla?
Yeah,
No.
yeah, exactly. Don't wish, right? But you and I both don't drive Teslas. But if you said, yeah, and then it had a rag top, right? A beige rag top. It was down, and you were listening to a particular song. That would freak me out. Because you shouldn't know what's in my hallucination or in my dream. We don't have a group. When someone reports the same thing, that's not a hallucination. That's called a memory because we were together when we saw it.
But the accounts of the resurrection, even if taken at face value, are nothing like this Tesla scenario. We don't have multiple individuals telling us of their post-resurrection appearances where we can corroborate the details of their experiences. If we did, then we could start to wonder how people were hallucinating the same dream. But we just don't have the kind of accounting necessary to make Wallace's illustration remotely applicable. If you care to look at peer-reviewed studies, group hallucinations and mass hysteria are real phenomena, as is polyphasic consciousness. as discussed in this study that juxtaposes the kind of testimony we have in the Bible with the recent, well-documented testimony of a room full of members of the Sisala clan of Ghana, who all attest that the corpse of their deceased community member came back to life to dance and play drums on the evening of October 23, 1967. A fascinating study. However, we don't have to call upon any of these to explain the Jesus appearances. Wallace has a handful of unaffirmed hearsay that arose out of decades of uncontrolled oral tradition that are best explained as legendary story elements.
And what you have are these group recollections. I think it's really hard to imagine that those are just hallucinations.
If you give me some reason to suspect that groups of people actually claim to have seen Jesus, rather than just claims that groups of people claim to see Jesus, then you might have something that needs explaining. With what we've got, the group appearances of Jesus are no more mysterious than the documented group appearances of Spider-Man, Superman, or Godzilla. In my video, How Christianity Probably Began Without a Resurrection, I go through a highly probable scenario that explains all of the confirmed evidence surrounding the early church, which requires only one person, the Apostle Paul, to have had any kind of vision. To assert that there had to be many hallucinations, or group hallucinations would be required, is simply to assume in advance that the story is true. Instead, we want to find out what's true based on what the evidence tells us. Thanks for watching. If it's been a while since you've seen How Christianity Probably Began, why not click on that thumbnail now, and I'll see you there.